Welcome back, everyone. Mr. Tanner here. Today we're going to be looking at different types of governments and some of the features that distinguish one type of government from the next. And then finally, we're going to be looking at what type of government does Canada have on this list. So without any further ado, let's get started. Well, let's start by looking at some definitions of what a government actually is. In a very simple definition, a government is the group that controls the members or citizens within the government region. And control doesn't necessarily a bad thing. I'm not trying to say it's negative, but they do have control over their citizens. Often that's for the citizens' benefit. Um, a federal government, a federal government would have control over certain aspects of the entire country, whereas a state government would only have control over that state. So there's different levels of government, and the larger the level is, like a federal government compared to a state government, the larger area they can exert that control. And the government has many important roles, or you could think of that as functions. So these are the things that the government does, such as providing a military to keep the country safe, a police force to enforce its laws, education through a public school system, and transportation by maintaining roads. So governments have lots of important functions within a society. And here on this slide, we're going to be looking at what are the factors that determine one type of government from another. So different types of governments have different amounts of control over their citizens. So they have different amounts of control. Some governments have complete control over their citizens. Some governments have very minimal control over their citizens. The second factor that we're going to be looking at for what determines the type of government is that different types of government have different ways of deciding who is in charge of the government. So those two differences again, different types of governments have different amounts of control over their citizens, and different types of government have different ways of deciding who is in charge of the government. And that brings us to the first type of government that we're going to discuss, which is a monarchy. And a monarchy, it's an R, a monarchy is a type of government where the head of state is a king or a queen. And in a monarchy, the next head of state will be a family member of the current head of state. And just for a distinction here, the head of state is the person who is in charge of the military of a country, and then some other things, but the most important factor would be the military. So a king or a queen is in charge of the military. We're going to look at the head of government here in just a second. The head of government is in control of the actual government processes, and often the head of state is the head of government, but not always in a monarchy. And in terms of the family member that will become the next head of state, it's almost always the oldest child of the current king or queen. So here we're going to look at two different types of monarchies, and this is where that differences between the head of state and the head of government are really going to come into play. So the first type is an absolute monarchy. And you can kind of think of this as the king or queen having absolute or complete power. So the king or queen, apart from being the head of state, is also the head of government. So they're controlling the military and they're controlling all of the other aspects of the government as well. And because that king or queen has complete power, the citizens in this type of country have no say. They don't get to decide how their government is run. So the citizens in an absolute monarchy have very little power, which means the king or queen have complete control over their citizens. The second type, which is much more common, is a constitutional monarchy. Constitutional monarchy. And in a constitutional monarchy, the king or queen is not the head of the government. They are the head of state, so they're technically in charge of the military, but they don't get to make any other governmental decisions for that country. Instead, the head of the government is is elected by the citizens in the country, which means that the citizens do have a say in how their country is run. England, for example, is a constitutional monarchy, and as you will learn, so is Canada. So Canada is a constitutional, that looks like Canada. Canada is a constitutional monarchy. The next type of government that we're going to look at is a democracy. And in a democracy, the head of the government is elected by the citizens in that country. And citizens also get to vote to decide on many of the laws that are passed in that country. So you can see in a democracy, the citizens have a lot of power, which means that the government has less control over those citizens. So again, in democracy, the head of the government is elected by the citizens, and the citizens also get to vote. Another important feature is that in this type of government, the head of the government always needs to be reelected after a certain amount of time, a certain number of years. And then even more important than that is often they have a number of term limits. For example, in the United States, the president has to be reelected every 4 years, and they only can have 2 terms. So the president can only serve for a maximum of 8 years in the United States. And the number of terms or the number of years varies in a lot of democratic societies, but they usually have term limits, and they almost always have to be reelected after a certain amount of time. The most common type of democracy is a democratic republic. And in a democratic republic, citizens don't get to vote on every decision that's made. That would be way too time consuming to vote on every single law and then always tally up the laws. Instead, citizens elect representatives or people who will do what they would like them to do to make those decisions for them. So that's why we vote for congressmen and senators in the United States, so that they will make decisions that are hopefully in our best interest. If we don't think they're making decisions that are in our best interest, when their term is up, we can always elect someone else. So that's a democratic republic. And this just says that the United States is a democratic republic. And then finally, the last type of government that we're going to look at is an authoritarian government. This means they have the authority to do whatever they want. So an authoritarian government has complete control over the citizens of their country. Citizens don't get to elect their leaders or vote on any decisions. So citizens have no power in an authoritarian government. The name for this that you've probably heard, it's one type, is a dictatorship. So a dictatorship is a type of authoritarian government. And then there's a couple different ways you can organize an authoritarian government. So an authoritarian government can be ruled by a single person. This would be called an autocracy. Or an authoritarian government can be ruled by a group of people working together, and we would call this an oligarchy. So authoritarian governments would look a lot like an absolute monarchy, except they're not ruled by a king or a queen. And typically the only way you can overthrow an authoritarian government is by force. So you might see in the news like a country having a coup, which is actually spelled like this. And a military coup is an attempt to overthrow an authoritarian government because you cannot vote out the leader of an authoritarian government. And then that brings us to look at the type of government that Canada has. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, Canada is a constitutional monarchy. And the Queen of Canada is actually also the Queen of England and also the Queen of Australia. So Queen Elizabeth II is also the Queen of Canada. Most people think of her only as the Queen of England, but that is not actually true. However, in Canada, the Queen has, and England for that matter, the Queen has very little power, and both countries, Canada and England, really operate like a democratic republic. So the people in these countries still get a vote on electives, and they still get to vote on uh, different laws within their country. Um, the head of government, so Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state in Canada. She would technically be in control of their military. The head of government in Canada is known as a prime minister, and his name is Justin Trudeau. And this is a picture of him right here. A prime minister is pretty similar to a president with a couple of different things. A president is the head of state and the head of government. So when Barack Obama was the president, he was the head of the government and also in charge of our military. Now with President Donald Trump, he is in charge of our military and also the head of our government. The other difference is you don't elect a specific person to be a prime minister. You actually elect a political party. So if the United States were to operate that way, we wouldn't actually know for sure right now who's really uh, going to be the choice for the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. We'd probably have a pretty good idea, but they wouldn't have made this announcement if we operated like a prime minister system. Instead, you would either vote Democratic or vote Republican or vote for some non like something like Libertarian Party that's outside of the main two. And then if that party won, then the party gets to decide who the prime minister is. So it's similar to a president, but the election process is a little bit different. And a prime minister is also not the head of state, so is not truly in charge of their government. So hopefully that makes sense for some of the differences in them types of governments. Again, with the main things we're looking at is a monarchy, which has a king or a queen. And then in a monarchy, there's absolute monarchies where they have complete control, and constitutional monarchies where the king and queen have very limited control, and instead they have a elected government leader to take control. There's a democracy that has the most control for the citizens, the most freedom for the citizens, because they get to vote on their leader, and they also get to vote on different laws that are passed. And then finally, there's an authoritarian government, and authoritarian governments have pretty much complete control over their citizens. Your next task is going to be to make a table kind of explaining the differences between these three types of governments. So hopefully these notes are helpful. As always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask.